right now?
All right. Seems like everybody's streaming in.
Mm-hmm.
Should we get started?
Let's do it.
All right. Welcome, everybody. Hello, hello. We are so excited to have you all here to be able to participate in a lecture and a discussion with, what's that? Oh, one reminder is that I think people come into this without their mic muted. So if you can make sure that your mic is muted, that would be really helpful. But also, we're also really excited to participate in this kind of lecture and discussion format with Thomas Padmanabhan. This talk is the first in a short series that's organized by the third year undergraduate studio, ARC 366. And our studio is titled Society of Rooms. And within the overall UIC curriculum, the studio traditionally explores some topics related to interior urbanism. And in this year, Thomas Kelly has spearheaded a series of outside talks with experts to share their experiences and ideas as a channel for building knowledge and dialogue around the interior and models in the design process. We are very happy to share these talks with the students in our studio, as well as anyone else who's been interested in this. I think that it's also pretty cool that we're able to snuggle up with our computers today on this very snowy day and enjoy learning about the work of this amazing practice. It's also my pleasure to hand things over to Thomas Kelly, who will formally introduce Thomas Padmanabhan and then lead a Q&A toward the end of the hour. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Stuart. So without further ado, Thomas Padmanabhan studied architecture at RWTH Aachen, La Sapienza Rome, and Cornell University. After his diploma, he worked for Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, Mealy Peter, and Diener. Together with Oliver Lutyens, Thomas established Lutyens Padmanabhan Architects in 2007 in Zurich, Switzerland. Thomas has taught as an assistant at the chair of Peter Markley and Marcus Peter at ETH in Zurich, and as a guest professor at TU Munich and EPF Lausanne. Along with his partner, he is currently the John C. Portman Visiting Design Critic in Architecture at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. The practice's recent work focuses on projects for housing in the Swiss residential districts surrounding Zurich and Basel, and currently they're also working on a project for a new residence for the Swiss ambassador in Algiers. And while much attention should be drawn to their built work and how it transposes the anachronistic formalisms of the Renaissance, like proportion, order, rhythm, and composition, to suburban Switzerland, we've asked Thomas to join us today to talk shop with us about his models. Often built at 1:50 scale, or close to our quarter-inch scale here in the US, the models are the means through which to understand their process, as well as their architectural project. Their models are as big as furniture and serve as clues to appreciating the visual wit and cunning from which to understand how their buildings approach construction, material, site, and history. The models convey an architecture of pragmatic superficiality and are open just enough to invite questions about subject matter that doesn't seem to carry as much importance as it once did, like form, attention span, delight, and glue. So thank you, Thomas, for your time today, and we look forward to your talk. I'm now
thank you.
Share.
Thank you so much, Thomas and Stuart, for having me, for inviting me. For me, this is the first time that I'm asked to speak about models, and I decided to. I'm going to try to speak about models to answer to myself the question how the model making process defines our practice and our process of form finding. Maybe we can start with the presentation. So you can go to the next slide, please. The title I have chosen, well, by the way, my practice is together with Oliver Lutyens, as Thomas said, and we started the practice about 15 years ago in Zurich. And when we started the practice, we did come from offices. We worked for offices as Thomas mentioned, for Miley Peter, for Dina and Dina, who did not insist very much on model building. A lot was developed in drawings, and if models were built, those models were built after the fact. They were built for presentation purposes, for example. And we were, when we started our practice, we met two dilemmas in our practice. The first dilemma was a practical dilemma. We worked in offices that did high-profile projects for very big budgets. Dina and Dina, Miley Peter, you know, beautiful concrete facades with different layers. The heroic time of Swiss abstract minimalist architecture was at its peak. And we knew that for financial reasons, if we get these middle-class projects, we would never be able to follow the same lines. The second reason was that we felt that development of Swiss abstraction was kind of artistically bankrupt at the time, and was only continuing because of kind of economic reasons, because the clients were flowing in. So we had a double dilemma, you know, how should we find our own way, and how should we find a process to find on, if we had only cheap projects, how do we find the themes and the subjects and the things that we can actually work on? So the next, please. What we did is right from the beginning that we would build models in the scale 1 to 50, and we will build the factual, the thing, the core of the model, the structure, the floors, the main idea of interior structure, and build it to be able to look at it. We did not design it. We can go to the next, please. Oftentimes, as you know, as architects, you don't get to decide on the volume of the building. It's somehow fixed. It's either fixed by building laws or because you need to exploit the maximum. Especially in Switzerland, it's a small country with very small plots where you're always building the maximum of what you can because the land is so expensive. So the idea of the volume and the proportions of the volume is never one where you ask yourself, which volume would I like to design? No, it's actually, you know the volume you need to do, and you better build it to experience it. So it's the other way around. You build the internal structure of a project. That's what we always do, that we have to do. And then we look at it, and we look at the proportions, the general proportions of width and depth and volume and weight and, of course, direction, proportions, and so on. So we discovered that our real wiggle room does not lie in how to define the volume of a building, but how to treat the facades. And as the budgets became smaller and smaller, and because the land prices were rising, so the budget for the building had to go down, and as the requirements for thermal insulation became even more strict, so a concrete facade became out of the question. We had to think about how we could work with eggshell thin facades where we would apply a thin layer of plaster on outer insulation. We basically end up with doing styrofoam facades where the dignity of the building would slip away, you know, and would kind of vanish, and we would not know how to deal with the abstraction of a building. So what we could do, we can go to the next. We would start to, and this would be, by the way, these images show a kind of work in progress of a recent project, not an old one. I will, in a minute, I will start to talk about earlier projects to explain the process. This shows a typical process in which you design a facade on the model. It's not been drawn before. It's actually cut. The stuff that we glue on the facade is just cut on the board. You just look at the element, look whether, you know, is this parapet wide enough? Is it thin enough? What's the angle? And just glue it on. This is the reason why our lecture is entitled Gluing is Committing. It is, every intern that comes into our office is usually trying to fix things on the facade with little pieces of tape or even needles, because she or he is not yet sure whether it's the right thing. But if you fix it with glue, and glue is cheap, lots of glue, so it sticks firmly, then you can confirm your first decisions and look at it, and it becomes the building is starting to become a fact that stands outside of yourself. That's not the representation of your thoughts. It's not a diagram of your that's created inside of your brain and that you materialize, but it's an artifact that you create step by step. And think of it when you are working as a team. I started with Oliver, we were 2, and now we are more than 2 in the office. Then it becomes more important that the thing that you produce, the artifact, is outside of yourself. It sits between you and becomes a piece of conversation. It is staying there overnight, and the next day you come back, you look at it with fresh eyes. So for the discourse and for the development, also for the discussion, this model that has a physical presence, and that's, as Thomas said, is like a small piece of furniture, is standing between us. That's really important. So let's continue. Next, please. Next. So I'm going to start I picked a few random projects, and this is the first house we realized. It was in Rüschlikon. It's a town outside of Zurich on the lake with a beautiful view. Next, please. It was the client was my brother-in-law and a business partner. They found a very small site for a lot of money on the lake of Zurich, and within kind of a 72-hour period, they had to bid for it, a ton of money, and we had to figure out how to put 2 houses on that tiny site. It was very steep. How the 2 houses would kind of share the garden or divide the garden, and these 2 families had to agree on the division, on the general scheme within like 2.5 days. They picked we've made several schemes. They picked within 45 minutes. They picked the same scheme and the opposite sides that was fixed, and then from there we went. So this was also, imagine, this created a given of, you can see there are 2 houses, there are 2 volumes, they have in plan, which I'm not showing, the stairs are kind of sticking in each other's side, there's an S shape dividing the 2 houses, but in the end, this was a fixed given, this volume, and what happens on the roof was also decided basically by the building law. So all we could do is we could build a model, and we could stick pieces of cardboard on it and start to design facades. Rip them off, redo them, rip them off, and walk around the building day by day. And so we begin to perceive something that is a fundamental miracle or kind of paradox of architecture. It is that architectural buildings are volumes, but in the end, they are also constructs made of surfaces because they're hollow and they contain space. So the question whether each facade is a thing on its own and what the connection would be to the facade around the corner to the next one is really a fascinating thing. So we decided to start with that each facade would kind of have its own life and be a bit autonomous. And so what we did is we found out that while we built this, maybe you can go to the next image. While we built it, we found out that it became also a fantastic communications tool with the client, because when the client saw the model once, and we would change it and bring it back the next time, for the client, the model would essentially always be the same because the volume was the same. So there was a stable core of trust that was building up. And then we would would cut windows into the cardboard. It's 3mm foam that is covered by two sides with white paper. You know that material probably. And some surfaces are there's brownish grayish paper glued on. So what we found out in this first project is that this scale of 1 to 50 is really good to work, because it allows you to decide in each case whether you show detail or whether you don't show detail. For example, if you look here on this model, you can see that there were certain choices were made. The windows are very abstract. There we decided not to show, say, divisions of the windows or window frames, whereas the railing of the roof terrace is clearly shown. It's very articulated. There are these white frames. And of course, the reason for this is that the railing on the roof terrace is important for the perception of the overall proportions of the building, while the windows are not. The division of windows are not, but the size of the windows and their proportions are very important. And of course, the grayish field on the lower right corner of the main facade, it's also important. It later turned out to be a natural stone that would be glued on the outer insulation, like a field of stone. And in this case, of course, compositionally, it would balance out the bay window in the middle that would kind of stick out and create a kind of a balanced out composition in the main facade. Maybe you can go to the next. This was a model that we did, even just a 2D model for the roof of the main room on the top floor of one of the buildings. The client was Scottish, and he wanted we first suggested a pyramidical roof with a beautiful interior roofscape, and because the building commission didn't allow it, we inverted the roof, so we built a pyramid under the roof that would stick into the space. And because he was Scottish, we invented some kind of pattern that was reminiscent of the Scottish flag. He liked it. Next, please. So when we went to the next project, which was a small rental apartment building, next, please, on the outskirts of Basel, the town of Basel, there we encountered a problem that is even more severe. We had to fully exploit the site, and we had there was a rectangular building volume that was the result of it, with a tower to the left where the elevator would be, and there would be 3 apartments on 3 floors, quite small apartments. So again, what you can see as a volume was not our wish, but it was just the economic result of the exploitation of the site. So we decided we need to invent something to gather the elements of the architecture around the building. We invented, or we kind of copied this central window that is on the upper floor with a gray frame or silver frame, with another window hanging like under its belly. We kind of copied that from Michelangelo, who did this kind of hanging, invented this relationship of elements where things would hang instead of being stacked on each other. And by combining this window with a horizontal line, we created a base and a kind of cross shape around which we found that many irregular elements, like the windows who had to be in certain places, could be easily absorbed. So there was parts of this model were about control, and parts of this model were about just letting things happen according to the wishes of the client or the needs of the different spaces. Next, please. And we even stressed more in this first stage of the project the fact that each facade would have its own rules and its own sense of character and if you wish, if you will, its own sensibility. While I described the compositional nature of the preceding facade, this one is really very clear in its structure. It's this this double E space, or this kind of almost grid, or this cross, that would kind of self-center itself, and that would kind of control very well these proportions. Next, please. We would also do interior studies in half-inch scale, where we would try to bring the same rules and the same sensibility into the interior space. We had absolutely no culture and also very little interest in an independent thinking about interior, interior. Like in some cultures, partially in America, but especially in England, there's a culture that you treat the interior almost as an independent entity, like an interior envelope. Whereas we found that we wanted to introduce the same scale that we use, and the same sense of the same grain, I would say, that we use in the facades for the interior. And next, please. This is now jumping ahead of about 10 years, when we were confronted with an altogether different problem. Next, please. We entered a competition. Oh no, this is in a funny order. Maybe go to the next image. We entered a competition for a low-cost housing project, where the goal was to spend only about half the budget that is usually spent on a square foot in Switzerland, and we basically designed a building in which you have duplex apartments that are stacked on each other like townhouses. Maybe you can go to the next slide. And that have their terraces serve as access routes. So basically, you have four duplex apartments stacked on each other, and each of the windows always show one unit. And you have only one staircase and one lift and one emergency staircase. So you cross the common balcony to access your apartment. And because this, of course, you can see this design was made was designed or was defined by the section, of course, because of the step back character of the building and certain building rules. But when we had to design the facade, we approached it in the very same way that I described it before. But here we realized that we had to think about fundamental difference. On the calm side, where the steps are, where the traffic noise is not so bad, we designed these soft facades of painted wood, where you had almost like private townhouses along these elevated streets. Well, maybe we can go back one image. While on the side that is, please go back. One to the front, please. Yes, perfect. Well, on the side that's facing the traffic from the train and from the streets, we decided to create a facade that would somehow work with the scale of the overall building. We decided to create windows that would unify the double height spaces of the interior apartments and the bathroom windows and all these windows inside into one large window, and that would create a kind of I think it's called colossal order. A colossal order is an idea from classical architecture, where instead of expressing the different floors in the structure of a facade, you create you are imposing a or superimposing a structure that goes from the street, from the bottom to the top of the building, and that envelops all the floors. So this is almost like a colossal order. And these are lapping corrugated fiber cement plates that are like from the industrial and agricultural tradition of Switzerland. So this is an example where, again, we're basically treating every building, when we bring the facades to the building, like a medical patient, you know, where this patient has a set of, you know, proportions that don't go away, you know, and that we have to work with those proportions and give them meaning in a way. And this meaning here would, for example, of course, express the fact that while this is not a very big building, we are unifying 8 floors into 4 to give it another sense of scale. Next, please. This is a detail in a half-inch scale model of one of the units from outside. Next, please. Now, to conclude this talk, we are moving away from these larger projects. Next, please, into this project for the residents of the Swiss ambassador in Algiers, a competition that we won 3 years ago, and that is now on site. We are currently building. It's coming out of the ground, and there you can almost see the process of model building in the way the model is built. By the way, this is the competition model. It's a working model, and also in this model, it was actually built in a rush, and then we would look at it and draw the facades from the finished model. This is what we always do. We don't draw facades. We measure the model after we do the model. But because the interior structure is already precise, you get always quite a precise model and a good sense of scale. So here, the model building is actually metaphorically showing the struggle of the project. We knew in this competition that because this residence of the ambassador is sited in a beautiful palm garden with a view of the Bay of Algiers, it's protected. So we decided, okay, if it's so protected with a big wall around it, we don't have to worry about security, and we'll do a one-story pavilion. So that's what we did. It's a one-story pavilion. It's easy to build the roof, you know, and then you do a roofscape where you can go on the roof and have a roof garden. But then how do you give that one-story pavilion an expression, a structure? What's the language, you know? And you know, talking to our friends here in Chicago, you know who the enemy is if you do a one-story pavilion. The enemy is Mies van der Rohe, because he did the Barcelona pavilion, which you probably all know. And because the problem is that the Barcelona pavilion is so iconic and so great that it creates a field of gravity that sucks you into a black hole and destroys your creativity, because it's like a prototype, you know. And what do you do against it? You know, you have to basically, in a kind of Freudian opposition to this terrible Miesian, this wonderful Miesian precedent, you have to kill him. So what we did is that we tried to make the floor plate of Mies van der Rohe's masterpiece that's floating. That's the main modern idea of the floating plane. We have to make that disappear and destroyed. So we did exactly the opposite of what Mies did. We created walls that would also become canopies, that would also become shields, that would almost entirely cover that the horizontal plane. You only see the horizontal plane a tiny bit of 2 inches, 1.5 inches here at the corner, the silver line. So you can see almost the thought struggle and the physical struggle in the result of the model. So you can imagine how we glued on these planes and ripped them off again and glued them on again until this kind of fragile relationship would have a balance that we would find would be good. So to conclude this talk, it's really interesting how for us, the order in which we build the model goes parallel to the thinking of an architectural hierarchy. And that it can go as far as that we tend to discuss every step in the model process. Once you do the raw structure with the floors that you've seen before, and you add the first walls and elements, then you look at it. And then based on the judgment of your eyes of these elements, you add the next elements. So it's also good for lazy people because the idea is that you stop when it's okay, no? Because you don't want to do more work than that. And we learned that we don't know what's going to be good or bad. We have an assumption of what it needs, what this facade needs, but this assumption is usually off. It's not right. No? But we have probably a good judgment for the next step. And then we do the next step, and then we do the next step and the next step. So this hierarchy of thinking about a project becomes almost a simulation of a construction, or maybe at least a simulation of the order, or the hierarchical order in which elements come together. And it's like when you bring 4 people into a room, 4 people who don't know each other, you can't really tell what the chemistry will be. No? You can have a guess. It's like when you make a dinner with friends, with people who don't know each other, you can guess what the chemistry will be, but you're not sure. No? It's the same here. So gluing is committing means every element that you put on, every layer must be glued and must be well done in a way. And then you can add the next, because only by committing to something, you can really judge whether the next step works or not. Otherwise, we would try to juggle 10 oranges at the same time, which almost nobody can do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thomas, so much. We were hoping to now shift into a discussion where our students would be able to directly engage with Thomas and the work of his office via the chat. So we'll hold out a minute for students to start dropping some questions into the chat. And perhaps Stuart, you and I could, and Abby and Palmyra and Chris, maybe begin engaging Thomas's work directly. I'm happy to still use slides as background for the discussion in case anyone wants to reference.
Yeah, I can maybe jump in here. Hi, Thomas. Now I feel like
Hi,
I
Abby.
need to start gluing things. I'm definitely somebody that uses a lot of tape and pins. But I had a couple questions about the model process for you. And the first one would be, I know the images that we saw were in specific kind of buildings themselves that you would construct in a model. Does your practice typically build the context or like neighboring buildings as physical models next to yours while you are constructing and designing your project?
That's Abby. That's really a very important question. No, we don't. And the reason is we are, we are this great. We love the kind of big cities, and we would love to, design, in the center of Chicago, a building. But all our sites, all our commissions were always in a kind of nowhere land, in the periphery of things, where the surrounding buildings would be existing, but they would be so poor in character that they would in no way support anything. So the context. So we felt that we have to reverse the context. Of course, we know the context and we see the buildings, but in our commissions, the buildings would not create something like a texture or something, a rule or something that we absolutely need to respect. But it was rather the opposite, that we felt, okay, now let's bring something to the side. Let's enrich the side. Let's be generous, towards the side, more in this direction, rather than trying to emulate something that was around it. Mm-hmm. But if you would ask me, if you would give me this commission in the center of Chicago, next to the Monadnock building, to make a building as big as this, of course, I would be sleepless, for 5 nights, and I would have to rethink this.
I was also wondering about your approach to color. I think that's something that we often kind of struggle with. And I noticed that many of the models or images have the, gray tone to it, but there's always a few elements that are kind of highlighted. So how do you guys normally go through that process?
For us, it's as you noticed, the oftentimes the color elements are the smaller ones, like, for example, doors or windows and stuff like that. So in our model process, that's an exception, of course, but in our model building process, they come at last, the last pieces. So while we have kind of understood the order and the relationship of the parts we have already glued, then we have the chance, by the help of the color, to somehow gauge the importance of these small elements. For example, if you have a door and the door is just really small, in relationship to the building, or here, for example, this image, there the letterbox is next to it where the person stands. So if you have this T figure formed by the letterboxes and the door, you can make it really more important than it is just by its size, by adding color. And it's like a crutch for architecture, because maybe in pre-modern times you would add lots of ornament or material that would be really intricate to it to heighten that importance, which we cannot do either for cultural reasons or for financial reasons. So this is really it's a way to finally to micromanage the hierarchy in the end between things. And sometimes, to bring things that are in the back, to bring them into the front, because I think that's sometimes wonderful. I think in the Algier project, there's these windows and these ornaments under the canopy in the depth of the building, and you can somehow, bring them forward. You can see these kind of Sol-LeWitt-esque ornaments. They're like rip-offs of the great American architect Sol-LeWitt. And they're ornaments that are inside, and maybe they lie, in a plane that's 5-6 meters behind the main facade, but that you can, by the power of their geometry, you can push them forward visually.
So almost calling attention to things that you may not notice at first, or the things that are most obvious in front. Yeah, I think that makes more sense now, kind of looking back through the images too. Thank you.
Thanks, Abby. We have a question from Mohammed Zagar. It reads, if a building has a system of treating each facade with a different rule set, then how do you decide how the interior reacts to each different rule set? And to add to that, Thomas, I'd be interested to hear how you manage the interior with a presentation and a series of projects that seem to be largely driven by compositional rules for applying facade moves.
Yeah, Mohammed, to your question, it's really a fundamental question that you're asking. How does a facade relate to the interior space and to the structure of the plan? super fundamental. And we, as I said, we could not decide on the shape of the building because the plots are so small in Switzerland. So imagine you have a funny shape of a building because of the funny shape of the site, and then you are introducing you have to squeeze in the apartments or whatever is inside. Then you first design the facade. So there is a rupture, a discontinuity between the structure of the plan and the facade. And we first thought that was kind of really strange and disturbing, but then we realized that it made us more aware of the fact that you need an idea for both. You need an idea for the plan, and you need an idea for the facade. The facade is by no means a result of the interior. Forget about that. That is kind of late modernist self-deception, probably. I don't know what it is. And so if we as a culture, including you, Mohammed, if we are more trained in probably more kind of easily, we can more easily do plans than facades. I would assume, like 99% of us. So then to treat the facade as a thing that has its own needs, its own rules, its own inherent logic is really liberating. And also in terms of hours that go into the facades, we really put many hours into these facades, in the gestalt, in the form of the facade. So that is, I think, that's also a good thing that one should do, because as 100 years ago in Western countries, or 120 years ago, they would have a set of, conventional rules of how they would do facades. We don't have that anymore. So we now have to put in hours and think about the facades really hard to give them the same value and bring them to the same level like the plans we do. And we were surprised. The second half of your question was, how do they relate, the plan and the facade? Well, when we design them independently from each other, we confront them with each other, literally. And we look what happens. And often the things that happen are not so bad. Sometimes you have to do little adjustments, but motivations from outside and motivations from inside collide. And I think it's a very, very adequate way of working, because in our lives, we know that our interior needs and the needs of our exterior lives, that they do not always match. But we have to struggle to somehow bring them together. But we are interested in that relationship rather than we would be in harmonizing them. Mohammed, does that answer your question?
Yeah, like a lot.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
We have another question here, which I think maybe pulls us further into the interiors, Thomas, where I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, there seems to be more diversity of materials in your projects. And so from Nathaniel Gillett, we have, do you prefer to have a lot of interesting materials on hand, or to interpret fewer materials to represent a larger number of possibilities when moving forward from the model? I think in short, what is in your toolbox or within the studio from which to design from? Like, what are these base palettes?
The funny thing is that we, when designing, we like to, especially at the beginning, but still today, we like to build models and keep it kind of vague and open what material it actually would be. So we claim that there's a primacy of the human eye over the materiality and the construction. We claim that architecture is really a visual profession, where you may create a lintel or a base or a certain horizontal line or structure, and it has its own architectural truth without you knowing exactly how it's done. And that's really liberating, because we had projects where a friend of us would come into the office to pick us up for lunch. He would look at the model and tell us, "Oh, you're doing he said, we thought we could do a plaster building, and he came in and he said, "Oh, Thomas and Ollie, that's funny. Why are you doing this Venturian beach house here?" And we're like, whoa, what is this? And the model was there, but suddenly we saw the model in painted wood or in shingles instead of render and continuous surface, and it suddenly transformed itself completely, while the architecture, the formal structure and the elements remained the same. And it was almost like an act of rejuvenation, an act of, transforming something. When classical architecture traveled across the Atlantic to the United States, and many buildings in the United States were built in wood, in painted wood, it was an incredible, beautiful act of transformation, when the fact that there was no marble, but there was wood, would give these buildings a new sensibility, a new voice, while the words were the same. And this is really the best thing to create your own voice. If you take things from another context and you bring them into your own context, and they will transform automatically. And that's beautiful, because then it's your own stuff. I mean, just by building it wood, created in a way American classical architecture. So it's and it's subtle things. And if you love something and you kind of take it as an example, often you're just in a different context, and that helps you to transform it, because anyway it will get transformed under your fingers.
I think a lot of times during the discussion, Thomas, it sounds like you and Ollie and other collaborators within your office are working out oppositions or differences of composition or zoning law that I think oftentimes seem like they're lending themselves to sensibilities about balance that may not always be clear to an outsider. Yet when you are specific to describe that balance leading to something like the colossal order, I guess I'm curious if you're surprised, or do you find yourself like leaning towards certain kind of formal tendencies with some of these acts of balance, or are you surprised with maybe some inventions of composition that arise?
I think it's both. What the biggest surprise is often how little it takes in the end to do to create a structure, a figure, a gestalt in architecture, that you need less than you were assuming at the beginning. So that's really great, because then you can stop earlier to work, in a way. It's I think the compositional, the what we can properly define as compositions, which is a idea where things are in balance, disparate elements are in balance. There, I think you need to just work on it, and it works out. What becomes harder and more difficult, I think, is when you're actually working with more simple ideas of order. For example, a series of bands that just differ by their height. There, it becomes very difficult to judge before you build it. So I think order, structure, and composition somehow require different strategies. But it's what is really important, I think, is to step back from what you think it is, to to be almost your own employee, when you're a student, to say, okay, now I'm going to try this. I'm going to build it, I'm going to glue it, and then I'm going to go for a coffee, and then I'm going to come back and look at it. To detach yourself from your work and take a distance and look back at it, and to bring in your friends with fresh eyes and to talk to them. That's really so important, because to be in action and to be the judge of your work and to alternate between these roles very clearly, that's really important. Huh? And I think I'm very skeptical of anticipating 3 or 4 steps in the process. I can only do 1 step at a time, and that's why. That's also, for me, it's very positive, because it takes away, for me and also for Oliver, the kind of creative anguish. Can you say anguish? The angst, the feeling that every creative person has, that is of failure, of doing a terrible thing, to not being good enough, and that. And if you say, okay, I'm just doing 1 step at a time, it's just 1 step, then you're not putting the entire weight of your judgment, on your work, which is not always good, But you can go step by step, and you can. I can promise you, by going step by step, you can go very, very far. And the model is not in just the creative thing in 1 step, but it's a slow process of transformation.
I can kind of see also this, as architects, we obsess over different things. And I'd say that maybe the common thing that we as architects often have a lot of anxiety or maybe anguish over is when the final product doesn't necessarily match the drawing or the model. I guess it'd be interesting to hear, the one thing left out from this presentation are that, all of these projects are either in construction or built, and there's a very different way of maybe assessing them through the lens of photography, of built work. But I guess it'd be lovely to hear you talk about like how precision or tolerance kind of lends itself to the built work, and what is the feedback you're getting from looking at the model and the build.
Thomas, could you go back to the Algeria model, please?
Sure.
There's a saying another saying in the office, which is kind of naive, is that the model never lies, And we did this model overnight in a rush. A collaborator, myself and Oliver, and you can see, for example, at the corner where the big canopy meets the vertical kind of floating lintel, almost touching at the corner, and it reveals the corner, and then you can see certain proportions of the slab, and you can see the kind of portions of the green window, and there's a vertical post also touching it. So all these geometric relationships, we first thought that they were kind of, more or less what we thought it was, and that they were kind of random, which in the process they were just the results of what we did. And then we tried to redraw the building according to we thought were the underlying rules. You know what the result was? It was a terrible failure. It was real shit. So what we did is we basically redraw the model. And I'm talking not about the process of the competition that had already passed. It was after winning the competition when we thought, now we get serious. Now we're serious architects, and we try to rethink this because it has to be more logical and so on. Blah blah blah. It was a failure. We had to faithfully redraw all the relationships between the different geometries here, and it was really a very humbling experience, because it showed you that there is intelligence in action that you have. There's an intelligence in doing the right thing in a rush, and there's an intelligence in your hand in model making that you don't have when you're like in a armchair in front of your computer and you think you're the smartest person in the world. So this is really, that was really a lesson. And here it was, in the case of Algeria, it was the most extreme because their relationships of geometry are so unforgiving in this project. Sorry, I missed the last question. It went away again. Sorry, I couldn't read it.
I think it opens it up to a really great question, which is asked by Michael Colzio, which is, do you think improvisation is a viable architectural design technique?
Somebody said something smart about improvisation. I mean, everybody who is good at improvising has a plan, right, at the beginning. Huh? So I think you should have a plan of what you want to do, and then you have to improvise. Like a great musician has a large repertoire of things she can do, and then you improvise. Here, for example, here it's very clear the assumption was the flat roof, the main layout of the ground plan, and then you would improvise. Yes, of course, you have to improvise. But we have for us, Robert Venturi and Denise Scott-Brown are really important figures, and they taught us, as opposed to their counterparts in Europe, like people like Aldo Rossi, Robert Venturi and Denise Scott-Brown, they started their projects with very matter-of-factly American ground plans that were super pragmatic, and they were very often very systematic and kind of almost cold in their character as a starting point, and then they would transform them. We try to do the same thing. In our first step when approaching a project, we try to look at it with very cold eyes and without passion, and we're trying to do the most straightforward thing that you would do. Maybe that's related to my time at Skidmore, Owens and Merrill, where the kind of cold, detached professionalism was important. That you would transform very complex programs into very calm plans that look like pretty Excel files.
That's why I would say, like, if I were to look closely at the way you use precedent, but also the way you eschew context or site specificity, there's this strange circling back to a new vernacular out of like known historical I guess complements or oppositions, and so the language itself, out of it comes I think a very clear wit that I do think traces back to Venturi and Denise Scott-Brown. Lovely. Stuart, do you have other thoughts?
Well, yeah, we only have a couple minutes, but I've been holding on to a question and I haven't known how to exactly ask it, but I first want to thank you for an amazing talk. And I guess the question is, how do you teach this? There's a great reliance on the development of sensibility and consensus and conversation. This that draws on a deep understanding of architectural history, but doesn't necessarily do it so explicitly, even as Venturi Scott-Brown. It's not as literal or it's much more tamped down. And the way that you talk about the models and things, it seems like it's almost picturesque, I think, in your evaluation, this kind of relationship between the order and the idiosyncrasies that come about. And I guess I'm wondering, I know you teach it at the GSD and things like that, and I guess I'm wondering how you approach imparting this sensibility or coaching this kind of sensibility, both in yourself, but then with others.
Well, for us, we have experienced that in teaching, we like to abandon the usual hierarchy of scales and of where you basically look at a site from distance and you zoom in, you create volume, plan, detail, and so on. We like to push the students right into the center of the project And usually we do exercises in the first weeks where we have them design parts of the projects, like an interior view of a project that shows a spatial texture and a facade in scale 1 to 50 without having the plan. And then in say the plan in a week, no, the interior view model in a week, the model of the facade in a week, and then the third week they have to combine this into a project. So there is it's a process where they have to rely solely on instinct, and they have to work so fast that they can't conceptualize anything before they do it. And we like then to we like the part of the design process not where you are outside of the project and you arrange things like when you bake a cake, you put all the ingredients into that pot, but when you already have the dough and when you're kneading the dough, the kneading part is more important than the assembly of the stuff. It doesn't matter if you put raisins or chocolate chips inside. It's really not important. It's the kneading part. So we try to accelerate that mixture of ingredients, really, and shortcut it. So because anything that a student will come up with in a rush will be great. It will always, and if we give them content to work with, like a precedent, sometimes we give them a precedent of a historic building. This semester we give them precedents of important personalities, like we call them protagonists, that bring a certain sensibility. For example, we had Richard Archberger, we had Louise Bourgeois, the artist, we had Lina Bobardi, and we would bring one image of Lina Bobardi's work, one image of Louise Bourgeois, and they have to work with that sensibility. And of course, they have a feeling. The students are natural, talents. They have a feeling of what this stuff can be used for. And instead of conceptualizing, they are, do you say scavenging? No, how do you say when you take things and you loot it, basically? You're using the stuff, and they use it because they have no choice. They can't digest it before using it. And then after 3 weeks, you have something in your hand. Every student has a project that is deeply rooted in content, that has a culture, that has a feeling of how things feel like and how they are touched. And then you can knead the dough and turn it into a project and conceptualize and think about it and discuss it and really distract the meaning from the content rather than trying to express content in form. Because I feel we always discover content rather than impose it on a project. Because even America, I think that's it's this direction.
I apologize for interrupting you. I just had a quick follow-up question because earlier you responded to Michael's question saying that improvisation is not really improvisation, right? It's through the process of having a plan and being learned in a way that you get to improvise successfully. So I'm wondering, when you're saying trust your instincts, doesn't that assume that these students, being master students, already have been taught something, and that's what they're leveraging in this sort of instinctive response? Instinct or talent are fallacies, right? It's really years of exercise and exposure to certain things that allow you to have that response and summon it really quickly. It's not something that anybody can instinctively do outside of a design school or in a much younger age. So in some ways, how do you get to that point?
I think that's really interesting what you're asking. I think it's true what you're saying, but it is a certain kind of course, design requires experience in design, but I think what we'd like to unearth is the practice of designing in the students' work rather than their ability to organize or conceptualize. their designs. I feel that these are often two different things, and we feel that often the students' analytical ability is trying to control the spontaneous or the instinct of the designer. I think that I'm not saying that the instinct is not based on experience, but I feel that there is it's like in sports, if you are good in a certain sport or experience, you have so many patterns of movement, that are programmed into your body, and these that allow you to have reactions that are super fast and super complex. And I feel that probably in architecture, in design experience, it may be a little bit the same. And if you focus on this and then step back and take time to reflect on it and not try to do it at the same time, I think that's what we think is maybe fruitful. Does that answer your question a little bit?
No, absolutely, it does. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, Stuart, I think we've gone over a little bit, and hopefully the students enjoyed both Thomas's presentation as well as the discussion as much as I have. Any last notes, Thomas, or words of wisdom for our students and faculty?
No, I just think that this lecture on models is one view, and it's very personal. There are some of you whose whole world will develop through the act of drawing, of course, and there are others who find other ways of developing their own, of tapping into their own creativity and energy. And I think it's very important to learn about yourself, what makes you productive, what makes you strong, whether it's conversation or whether it's focus, whether it's community or whether it's model making. So this is just one example of many things that make you an architect, potentially.
Thomas, thank you so much. I think you've given us a lot to digest, and I think more importantly, I'd like to also note to the students, I think one of the joys of the work that Oliver and Thomas do in their office is that they use the medium of model making as both a representational tool, as a presentation tool, but always in the service of an open dialogue. And I think that's something that is really generous and optimistic, and lends itself to like delightful architecture, but delightful conversations about architecture. So Thomas, thank you so much for your time. Truly appreciate it. Students, on March 9th, we'll have Giancarlo Valle come in and talk about modeling clay. And we look forward to that. Thomas, please give our best to Oliver, and
I will.
We hope to see you soon. Cambridge, Zurich, or Chicago, or elsewhere.
Same here. Thank you so much for having me, enjoy your semester with Stuart and Thomas.
Thank you so much. This has been amazing.
Thanks a lot, Thomas. We're going to go ahead and sign off and close the session.
Okay. Bye-bye.